Welcome to Full Stack Reactive with React and Spring WebFlux. My name is Matt Raible. I had this fun drawing done of me in Ireland a few weeks ago. But more importantly, I am a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity, no running water, had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day, and yes, it felt like it was uphill both ways. This is a cabin that I was born in. My sister was born in one corner, I was born in the other. My dad was the doctor with a hunting knife. Like, why do you need a hunting knife? Well, luckily, he was there with it because I came out with my umbilical cord wrapped around my neck, and he had the essential tool. You'll notice in this picture there's a border collie sitting very still. It's a rare thing. His name is Sagan. I was very excited when Spring I/O came out and they named that project Sagan. I think they named it after my dog, but maybe not. I live in Denver, Colorado with my lovely wife, Trish, and awesome kids, Abby and Jack. I also have a middle child. This is Hefe, 1966 21 window bus. I bought him off eBay in 2004, and I thought he was going to be done in 6 months for 12 years. So we went through 7 different shops. If you follow my blog since 2004, you've probably seen me write about him. I'm very happy to say that he's done. He's a very expensive obsession. If you have a similar problem with Volkswagens, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. I work for a company called Okta. We do users as a software service. The acronym for that is UAS. Not very good. You could change it to authentication as a software service. Not much better. How many people here are Okta customers? Got a few of you. How many people are developers? Almost everyone. So Okta has a great policy. Ever since I joined about 1.5 years ago, we've started treating developers the same as customers. So if you'd like to go out to lunch, me buy you a beer, that's all expensible. Pretty nice. So now that you know a bit about me, I'd like to know a bit more about you. First of all, who is not using Spring Boot? The one guy in front. How many are using Spring WebFlux? Got a couple of you. How many on Spring Boot 2? Okay, most of the room. Not a bad upgrade, right? It was pretty easy. Preferred server-side languages. How many people prefer Kotlin? It's about 5. There's one guy that's really high back there. All right. What about Groovy? It's about the same amount. Scala, anyone doing Scala? 2? All right, not for that many. Front-end frameworks. Anyone using Angular? Okay, that's about half the room. React? Okay, that's the other half, or maybe it was the same. Anyone doing Vue.js? Okay, it's about 10 or 15. What about TypeScript? JavaScript? Okay, it's about even. So this presentation was inspired by a blog post I wrote this week, because you have to do that kind of stuff when you're using JavaScript frameworks. You have to write the presentation the night before, you have to write the blog post 2 days before, so it's all up to date. Might not be next week. So I'm going to talk a bit about reactive programming today, and then I'll introduce you to Spring WebFlux. I'll show you a demo with Spring WebFlux building an API and allowing you to do real-time data or streaming data. And then I'll show how techniques that you can use in a React app to actually consume the real-time data, and then I'll secure it all. And so I did practicing of the demo that I have, and if I create all the code from scratch without talking in my room by myself, 45 minutes. So I kind of want to do it, but I'm not going to just throw away the slides, not even do slides and just do the whole thing, but it's a lot of code. So what I'm going to do is the Spring WebFlux part of it. I worked with Josh Long on that. I'm just going to show you that code rather than creating it from scratch. And then for the React part, I'll actually create all that from scratch. So reactive programming is an approach to writing software that embraces asynchronous I/O. It's a small idea with big changes. It basically means that you can alleviate restrictions or inefficient resource utilization by reclaiming the resources that would normally be blocking and not allowing you to proceed as they wait for I/O activity. So here's an example of a blocking system where we have a file reader. And this basically sources a file using a regular file, java.io file. It pulls the results out of the source one line at a time, and then it accepts a consumer down here to actually accept those payloads and get what's called when there's new data. And then if you look at the asynchronous version of that, first of all, it's much longer. Right? There's much more to do. It's a bit more complicated. So this time we're using a Java NIO file path. When we create the channel, we specify that we want a executor service, right? And that will invoke our completion handler. So you see on the top of the class there, it implements the completion handler. And so since we're implementing that, we have to override the completed method. And if you look at that, we're reading the result, and then we're basically doing a similar thing. We're accepting, the bytes out of the byte buffer, and then it's passed back to a consumer. So it's way more complicated, but at the same time, it's more efficient. So how do you map your Java brain to asynchronous I/O and pushback mechanisms and flow control in distributed systems? In reactive programming, the ability for the client to signal how much work it can manage is called back pressure. Right, to signal to the upstream clients that you have back pressure, hey, I can't handle this load, wait a minute. And there's a good deal of projects that allow you to handle this in the Java ecosystem. There's Vertex, there's Okta Streams, there's RxJava that support reactive programming. And the Spring team has Project Reactor that allows you to do all of this. And so there's a common enough ground between all of these various frameworks that they came up with a de facto standard called the Reactive Streams Initiative. And so it basically defines 4 types. There's a publisher, which is a producer of values as they arrive. And then there's a subscriber that basically consumes and receives notification of new values through its onNext method. Then there's a subscription, which you can connect to a publisher. And then there's lastly a processor, which basically implements or extends subscriber and publisher. And so Spring Framework was actually released, or 5.0 was released last year at this time. So it's been, a year. It builds on Reactor and the Reactive Streams specification, and it contains this new component model called Spring WebFlux. And so one of the first things I say when I talk about Spring WebFlux is if you're building CRUD apps, you probably shouldn't use it. And people are like, why? Why shouldn't I use it? And the truth is, it might not be as performant. So I'm guessing that the few of you that raise your hands that are doing Spring WebFlux have like really high processes that you need, NIO, you need non-blocking I/O to make that better. I got a good comment on Reddit from one of the articles that Josh and I published last week. The guy basically said that performance differences are negligible unless you're doing a lot of API calls at a scale of at least 500 requests per second. So if you're not doing that much processing, Spring MVC is probably going to work just fine for you. But if you want more processing power and you utilize your resources more, take a look at Spring WebFlux. So we all know and love Spring Boot. I like that it can be written on a slide almost, as far as a POJO that can be persisted to a database. If it wasn't for Java and all the getters and setters, it would fit on a slide. Right, but I had to comment those out. Of course, I could use Lombok, but I didn't in this example. So you can see you just have a demo application, you have an entity class, and then you have a JPA repository that can not only persist that entity, but it can also have REST endpoints. That's what the repository REST resource does. This is a great way to implement something that is not recommended on ThoughtWorks Radar. It's called the anemic domain model. It's when you have an entity that maps directly to a database and then you expose it on the web. It's great for demos, though. So what I'd like to show you now is how to build a Spring WebFlux API using Spring Initializer. So I will, from time to time, forget that I'm not mirrored And so if I'm talking and you actually don't see anything on the screen, like shout out, let me know, hey, you're doing it wrong, and then I'll remember to mirror my displays. Okay. So that's a little small. Hopefully the fonts, I'll bump them up and it'll work here. So you know what? I think I'm going to attempt to do the full everything from scratch. Why not? Right? Seems like fun. So I have this script, right? Because it's tough to remember all this stuff, especially when you get into the React stuff. So I'm going to start by creating a brand new application. And I'll just move this directory in case it fails. All right, you got to have a backup. So go into apps, and then I have a alias called webflux start. And so if we were to look at that, you can see it hits start.spring.io, it hits the starter.zip endpoint, and basically specifies data MongoDB Reactive, WebFlux, DevTools, and Lombok. So if we run that, it downloads a demo.zip. We can unzip that into a reactive web directory, and then remove demo.zip, go into reactive web, and open it up in IntelliJ. How many people prefer Eclipse? Really? Only 5? How many people prefer IntelliJ? Everyone else. What about NetBeans? No? He's not here? How many people have to support IE 11? A couple of you. Yeah. At the Belfast Jug in Ireland, there was a guy that had to support IE 11, and what else did he use? He was a NetBeans guy. That's right. Okay, so there's not much in here to begin. So I'll look back at my steps. The first thing I'm going to do is create a profile entity. And so this is just, a regular entity with Lombok annotations. A bigger font, yep. So we got font, we got demo. Let's see if is that big enough? More. Ooh. Okay, it's a pretty simple class so far, right? And then we have a profile repository. You can see it just extends reactive MongoDB repository. Profile, got to be able to spell. And then lastly, a data initializer. So sample data initializer. And so what this guy does is you can see, first of all, it's only enabled on the profile, or the demo profile. So this is a way with Spring Boot and Spring WebFlux that you can basically have something that's only activated when you're running that particular profile. And so what happens here is we go through and we talk to our repository. First of all, we delete all the records, right? We're talking to MongoDB, so this isn't H2, like things don't get deleted when we clear out our target directory. So we have to delete all the data, and then we're just entering in some sample profiles, right? A at email.com, B, C, D, and then we're going ahead and printing those out. So at this point, we should be able to start it. There's something up here, so no JDK specified. Try it anyway. Oh, you got to go in and modify the preferences or module preferences. Hold on. Well, or you just use Maven, right? So how many people type Maven Spring Boot all day long? All right, bunch of you? Well, maybe this will help. So you can go into here. You can say default goal, Spring Boot, run. Then you only have to type Maven. All right, handy tip. No? Oh, it doesn't like the spaces. How many people use spaces? How many people use tabs? Well, it's about half. Okay, well, people make more money if they use spaces, you know. There was a Stack Overflow survey that they actually published that. I don't know why the default goal is not working, but usually does. So if we start it up, you'll notice it actually didn't put anything in the database. First of all, something's already running on 8080, so there's a great tool out there called fkill that you can actually specify like ports to kill, and then it'll actually run it. So that's fkill-cli. It's an npm dependency that you can install. So this started up. If we were to hit, there's no endpoints or anything, so we can go ahead and create one. First of all, I'm going to create a profile service, so I can have multiple controllers that talk to the same thing. So profile service. You can see this is talking to that profile repository. It's got a flux for all, a mono for singles, and updates and deletes. Basically, the difference between a flux and a mono is flux is for lists or multiple pieces of information, and then a mono is for a singular one. And there's also this do on success down here that I'm just going to comment out for now. And then we can create a controller. So this will be a profile REST controller. And this guy looks very similar to what you're used to, right? It has a REST controller annotation. It has a get mapping for the ID. It has a post mapping for create. And there's not a lot that's very much different from what you're normally used to with Spring MVC. But this is actually using Spring WebFlux. You'll notice it's returning a publisher rather than an object that's wrapped around like a response entity. And so if we are to restart, first of all, to run the demo profile, what you can do is you can export Spring profiles active as an environment variable, and now it'll have that demo data in there. And then so you can see it printed out there, and then if we go here and we use HTTP 8080 profiles, you see they're actually printed out there, right? But we're not really embracing the power of Spring WebFlux yet. So let's go ahead and create the non-classic version, which is to do actual handlers and endpoint configuration. So I'm going to start by creating some events, because what I want to do with this is I actually want to have the profiles, and then when you add new profiles, I want to publish that as an event, and then I'm going to use WebSockets, and I'm going to use server-sent events to actually push those out to the browser, right? Those are the two techniques that basically the browser can use to talk to streaming data. So we'll start by basically creating a profile created event. So you can see it's pretty simple. It just extends application event, which has always been a part of Spring. And then we need a publisher for that. Profile created event publisher. This guy's a little more complicated, but not much. Basically has an executor, and on the application event, it offers it up, and the queue will actually take that and call next on it. So once you have that done, then you can create a WebFlux or WebSocket configuration. And so the reason that I have this, first of all, I need to go into here and undo this now, right? Because I can actually, on success of creating an event, I can publish that since I have that event now. And then I can go in here and create WebSocket configuration. So this guy is definitely more code than we've seen for most of the classes. But you'll notice here, first of all, it's got a bean that just has a single thread executor. It's got a handler mapping. This is part of Spring WebFlux. This is how you map stuff, and I'll create a profile handler and a profile endpoints configuration to do not the classic Spring MVC, but the WebFlux model. And then we go ahead and have a handler adapter, this event publisher, and this is how you basically consume the event publisher, create a flux with it, and then you can go and basically, we get that event, which is the ID and the name of a profile, and we just return it as a JSON object through WebSockets. So I'm going to create a profile handler. So this is the WebFlux way of doing things, right? More so than Spring MVC. You'll notice it's just a component, right? It's not a controller, but it basically has that get by ID, all delete by ID, and it's returning monos with a server response. And then it basically writes it out, specifies the content type, specifies how to get it, and how to read it. And then we need an endpoint configuration for that, so profile endpoint configuration. You can see this takes in that handler, and it's got this case-insensitive request predicate. So the reason I'm using that is so I can actually have profile like all uppercase, right, all lowercase, mixed case, and it'll still find the actual object. So create a new class, put that in there. And you can see lowercase URI server request wrapper just wraps the request and makes it so it can find that with any sort of case. Okay, so everything should be compiling now. And let's see what the next steps are. So the next steps are to actually make sure that that all works still. And then make sure we can hit it. Right, and we can actually publish to it, so you could do put 8080 profiles, or actually post for create, and you could say like name equals matt.raible@okta.com, and it actually creates it, right, and then you can grab that one, and you could say I want to actually fix that typo, and I want to do a put. Oh, a name, right? Doing it wrong. Email. So now it puts it in there, right? You can modify it. So we have a full REST API that we could even delete things if we wanted to. But the cooler thing is to see how the web sockets work. So in here, we can create a web page that subscribes to the web sockets. So we'll call it static ws.html. So simple page, you can see it's just using the WebSocket API, which you don't actually need to import anything or use any fancy frameworks for. Just creates a new WebSocket to talk to that endpoint, and then when it gets a message, it actually goes ahead and says, hey, I got something. So to simulate messages, I'm going to create a script, call it create.sh. I just called it create. And so what it does is it talks to that endpoint with curl, and it goes ahead and adds a new random record, right? So if we were to go to our terminal here, and first of all make it executable, and then run it, it creates data, and so to see it, we have to go to localhost 8080 WS, and there it is, right? If we do another one, pops up, right? So that's all working, like that's coming through. The other thing that I like to show is a server sent event. So Java class server sent event controller. So this is a little different from WebSockets, but it's still cool technology. So this guy, you can see, it subscribes to that same Flux, the profile created event. So it takes that in the constructor, and then it calls that Flux create again on the publisher. And then we have a new endpoint called SSE profiles, takes text event stream value. That's the most important part of this. Without that, the whole SSE server-side events doesn't really work. And so then we map it and we write it out. So now if we restart things, And the cool thing here is we can actually go HTTP 8080 profiles or SSE profiles -s. Is that the right one? Well, let's see. Okay, so that one's coming back. Stop it, start it again. Never know. Try this. Pretty sure that's what I did. Let's look at the code, right? All looks the same. It's a REST controller. Oh well. It's pretty cool. You can basically stream, and when you're listening for that, it actually publishes your information right there. So I'll switch to my backup one since I know that one works. I don't know why this one isn't working, but if I go to cd the apps.back, reactive web, and run this one, then we should be able to stream that information. Well, that one worked earlier. Oh, you know what? It might be the fact that it's trying to do application JSON. Well, we'll get to the React part. So React, right? The way to build React apps, one of the easiest ways. You got a comment? You see what? Right, but the second part is just the actual HTTP, right? I mean, if you did this, right, it should still work. I don't know. Worked earlier. You gotta have one failure in your demo. People don't believe it's real, right? It is SSE, right?
No, in the web browser, in the second tab.
Right. Well, that one, it won't matter because we have to use JavaScript to call it. So if we were to do that, like, I don't know why it's just not registering. Well, that one doesn't work. I'll try a different one, right? I have the full, like, Monty version here. Spring WebFlux. And if this one doesn't work, you'll notice I'm using a snapshot build of Spring Boot. I'll just blame it on that. It worked yesterday. Well, this one's got security and everything in it. Huh? Right, now it's unauthorized. So, moving along. So one of the things I like to talk about whenever I talk about JavaScript and JavaScript frameworks is the various flavors of JavaScript that exist, because people might not be aware how we came to have all these different ones and what ES6 and ES7 and all that is. So ES4 was basically released in 1999 with IE6. How many people were web developers in 99? All right, there's a handful of you. So when IE6 came out, it was awesome, right? It was way better than anything else. And then, of course, it stagnated, and nothing came out until IE7, which I don't know if that was much better, but it took them like 10 years, right? ES5 wasn't released until 2009. So you'll notice that the renaissance of like Java really started in like 2006 with jQuery, and it's funny to look back and see like Flex 1.0 and Spring 1.0 happened like in the same month of March 2014, or not 14, 2004. And then, you know, Flex is already dead and Spring is thriving. And then we have ES6. ES6 actually looks a lot like Java. You have classes, you have modules, and ES7 is actually not that big a deal. All it really adds is an exponential operator and the ability to look into an array and see if it includes a particular object. And so there was a notion of what's called a decorator that we in Java land call an annotation. There was that for ES7, but they removed it. And so that's one of the big reasons that Angular, if you're an Angular user, uses TypeScript. Because with TypeScript, they have a bunch of syntactic sugar that allows them to have annotations or decorators on there and do what you'd like to do or make the code a bit cleaner. So this is what TypeScript looks like. This is an example. You can see it's very similar to Java. As far as prefixing a private variable with an underscore, you don't have to do that. That's not a convention. You can, of course, adjust your TS-lint settings to use that if you want. If you're doing constructor injection, like you see here, the only reason I even have this here is to show that you can do optional constructor arguments with that Elvis operator, right, the question mark colon. If you actually didn't, or if you use something like this, you actually don't even need the private name. If you have an argument that comes into the constructor, it automatically sets it as a this variable, so you can modify it or get to it that way. There's also getters and setters, which look a bit different from what we have in Java. In Java, you have get name and set name. Here, it's actually a space between them. And how it works is if you do object.name equals, that calls the setter. If you do object.name and you're just reading it, that calls the getter. And then you can see there's string interpolation in the toString method there, so you can inline variables. So before you can write any code in TypeScript, you actually have to use npm and node. So many people, at least I did back in the day, thought that node was more for server-side rendering, and it wasn't actually something that I might use. But if you're an npm user, you use it every day. So it's very useful for building and optimizing clients and using frameworks like React and Angular. So with React, it's very easy to write a hello world app. I remember when I migrated from AngularJS to Angular 2, it was about a 9-month span, was very painful because they were doing release candidates and they were breaking stuff between release candidates. Like, that's not very nice. If you're going to call it a release candidate, like, don't break anything, right? So it was very painful, but at the same time, they had a getting started with Angular guide that if you printed it out, it was 10 pages. Right? And so it went from you could use AngularJS in 10 lines of code to you needed 10 different files to actually start with. I actually think that that's a good thing because what happened is the CLIs really took off. Angular CLI you might have used, it generates those 10 files for you. React has a similar thing with Create React App. But the nice thing about going back to just React plain is that you can actually have an app with only a few lines of code. It's not like Angular, it doesn't require all those lines of code. The one thing you might notice here is that, hey, there's HTML in my JavaScript. When React first came out in 2014, this was very controversial. They call it JSX, or if you're doing TypeScript, it's TSX. But it's basically a way to have not only HTML, but your components references as HTML things in your document. And so if you're a Java developer and you've done servlets and you put HTML in your servlets, you're like, oh, not that again. But really, it's not so bad. So definitely a lot of controversy in the beginning, but now a lot of people have embraced it, and it works really well. So the main difference in how React works versus what you might be familiar with, something like jQuery, is jQuery uses like imperative code. So you can see here, this is basically demonstrating a feature that's on Facebook that I didn't even know about. So if you get over 99 notifications, your little notification icon lights on fire, right? So this is the logic to do it in jQuery. It basically says, hey, if it's over 99 and it doesn't have fire, then add it. And you have to do all this if else. So it's very verbose. It's a lot about managing your state and transition. And it gets really hard with lots of states to actually implement that logic. And it describes how you change the UI. Versus what React uses is declarative code. So this defines the UI you want. You can see it's much simpler and very easily readable. One of the things you might not know is when you first hit this logic, it's going to return a div with class name Bell. But when that logic changes and when that data changes, when that count changes, it actually will do a diff. And instead of returning all of this, it'll just slide in that span into the top one. So it's very efficient. That's why it's very fast. That's why it's similar to Git. And Git does a diff when it sends data to the server. It doesn't actually send all the the files. So this declarative style is much less lines of code, and then you also have props and you have state. So props defines what a component is, and then state defines what a component knows in React. Like I said, create React app makes it very easy to develop React apps. npx create React app, my app, that's all you need. And then if you want to use TypeScript, there's just a way of passing in a scripts version, and then you say React scripts TS. And so this doesn't really give you a good overview of how to develop React apps, and that's not really the point of the talk, right? It's how to do streaming data in React. So I invite you to watch this video. It's only a year old. It's by Eric Vicente, who used to work for Facebook. Does a very good job of like building an app and letting you build it along with him. There's a GitHub repo and everything. And just to let you know, for those of you who are taking pictures of the slides, I will publish them afterwards, and I'll give you a link to that at the end. It'll probably take me an hour or so after the talk to actually get them up there, but you will be able to download them and see all this stuff. So some solutions with React, these are basically the 5, I think there was one other one that I explored. So the simple way that you can do is just you keep polling an endpoint, right, every second and say, hey, is there more data? Is there more data on that profiles endpoint? But you'll notice when I do that, it actually is kind of a jarring user experience. A little bit better way is to use Arcs.js with observables, so you can subscribe and basically do that same interval stuff, but it's not as bad of a jarring experience. WebSockets work pretty well. I did find some issues using Socket.io. So Socket.io to connect to Spring WebFlux, I wasn't able to get that to work. Oh well. And then service and events in event source, equally well, works well with just plain old WebSockets. And then RSocket, I actually tried that, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. So I'm going to build a React client now, but I do like to know if anyone has any questions so far. Yes?
All the examples from the previous slide are all based on observables?
So the question was, are all these based on observables? No, only the second one, Arcs.js. You got a question, sir? How do I deal with Edge not supporting SSE? So I'm a developer advocate. I don't use Edge. I mean, one of the beauties of being a developer advocate is you just use the latest and greatest stuff, right? The fact that Edge doesn't support SSE, are they adding it? I don't know. I haven't really followed it. It's similar, I would say, to Safari and progressive web apps, right? They didn't have support for the longest time, but once the community put pressure on them, they actually have it in the nightly builds. 3 years and they're not interested. Well, one of the problems that I'll show you, both with WebSockets and event source, is that there's really no standard for how to pass authorization information. So I'm going to secure this app after I build it, and then to actually talk to those endpoints with an authorization header with like an access token in it, it just doesn't work. And so there are polyfills out there, there's libraries you can use. Those don't work either. Or at least they didn't work with Spring WebFlux. They might work with the example that they have. So let's look under the hood of React here. I got to like mirror again. Okay. Clear, clear. It's hard to type with like a slanted keyboard, right? So let's see where we are. Okay, and apps. So I have a shortcut, another alias called create React app. And so what it's going to do is it's going to use npx, create React app, takes whatever name I pass in, and then does TypeScript. So I can do CRA and then React app. More questions? Right, it's always a good time. We do an npm install. Like people that complain about Maven download the internet, like npm downloads the internet and all its friends, right? If I did a count lines of code on this project after I actually create it, it's like millions. We'll actually start that. It's fun to look at. So cd react app clock. We'll just let that sit there for a while. So actually, I don't want to open up that one. I want to open up both of them so we can go back and forth between them. So I have apps, I have React app, and I have the React web. The React web should still be running. HTTP 8080 profiles. Oh, it's that one. So fkill 8080. There we are. Look, there's even some Lisp in there. 6 lines of code. But 1.8 million lines of code, right? That's because JavaScript doesn't have any way of like bundling it in a binary form and sending it down, right? So the node modules directory is all the source. It's just kind of how it works. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there. Only 1.2 million lines of JavaScript. So if we go into reactive web, start that up again. First of all, we'll do Spring profiles active equals demo and MVN. And then this React app, it basically has a app.tsx, which is an entry point. And so if we go in here and we do run yarn start, just show you what it looks like. You can see it's very simple, but it doesn't like that we have a console in there. I didn't do that. Oh well. Never seen that one before. Keep going, Matt. All right, so the first thing I'm going to want to do is actually have a method that talks to my API, right? So we'll use React fetch. And you can see, so component did mount is a way that you can do that. We'll talk to the profiles endpoint there. And so when this actually loads, it goes ahead and takes that, grabs the data, and sets it in a local variable called profiles. So one of the things I'm going to do is, just like in Java, I'm going to have types, right? Since we have TypeScript, so I'm going to create an interface for profile. And it's going to have an ID, which is a number. And it's going to have an email, which is a string. And then we're going to have props, right? These are inputs that go into your component. So app props, or interface app props. It's just going to be empty, and then interface, we'll call this app state. And this is going to have the isLoading, right, which is Boolean, and then profiles, which is an array of type profile. All right, looks pretty familiar to Java developers. And then we can have our constructor here. And we'll set those profiles to nothing and isLoading to false. And then you have to add these, app props and app state. And then if we can't fix this thing over here, it's a bad demo. So I'm going to try one thing. I'm going to take this, and I'm going to rm-r node modules. And then we'll try it again with npm. So how many people use yarn? We have about 20. Who uses npm instead? All right, we have about 30. So I switch back and forth between them. I work on the JHipster project, and we've had yarn as our default for about the last year and a half. It's caused more problems than it's fixed. So we're actually switching back to npm as a default. When it first came out, it was great because you know what npm didn't have? It didn't have caching built in. Right? And so doing demos like this on stage was, first of all, no fun, right? Because you would have to, reinstall everything every time. And then it added caching, and so it got better, and then npm basically copied it, and now they're kind of competing. And hopefully this will solve the problem. Nope. Man, demo gods aren't nice today. Okay. Where do we go from here? We go into the one that I have done, maybe? Let's see, dev Okta. And we'll try this one. Install it. Any more questions? Like, this is the hardest part, right? Like, if you ever do a workshop, it's setting up someone's machine, and this is like the weird stuff that you're like, how in the heck did that happen? Could be my version of Node. It looks like, what happens, and this is why I lock down all my dependencies when I do any tutorials with npm, because what happened here is probably someone actually released a new version of a library between 8 o'clock this morning and 11 o'clock, and even though I have everything locked down, like, it still picked up, a minor bump. And And so if that one failed, and this is like the GitHub version that failed too, then yeah. So I'll talk you through the code. Can't actually show you how it works. Sorry about that. So this right here will basically, hit that profiles endpoint and grab that data and set it locally, but we're not getting the streaming data, right? So there's a few different techniques that I talked about. One of them you can use, well, first of all, I want to show, this is cool, but then to, show it, you got to do this React. I have this shortcut here. You can do profiles list, and then we grab profiles. So that's how you do, a list and iterate through it. And then to get that data, you can pull it out of the state. So since we're setting it in the state here, we can pull it out, profiles and is loading. And if it's loading, then return true. Actually, this needs to go above here, right above the return. So right here. And then this changes to profile. And so you can see if there's nothing there, it's loading still, then it goes ahead and shows that loading screen. And then down here is the profile list, and then it loops through that. So I'm going to take this, and this is one of the cool parts of React that I really liked when I first started working with it, is you can make this into its own component called like profile list.tsx, and then we'll just replace like app with profile list. So we replace, well, we don't need that. We don't need the logo. We can say replace the props, the state, the name. All right, that one. And then we can actually get rid of this stuff. Get rid of this guy here. Reformat, and then get rid of the bottom one. And so now we have a profile list, right? It's kind of self-encapsulated. There's not a whole lot more information here. And then we can go back to our app and actually undo everything. And then we can just change this to profile list, right? And so now we haven't really polluted our app. And if we wanted to do other things where we have routing and stuff like that in here, we could certainly do that. So we have the profile list now. And the different techniques, fortunately, I can't show them. I mean, this is what you usually do, right? Nah, it's a VS Code thing. I mean, I wish someone published right now what it was. Let's maybe we could do this. This might work. Package.json, and look for, well, this is the done one, right? We want apps, this one right here. We'll try locking down the versions. Never know. Might work. Because without the demo, it's kind of not fun. And then lock these ones down. Okay, try again. RMISR, node. Try yarn again. Doesn't like that I have package locked now. It's like, hey, you started using NPM. Why? Any other questions? Okay, yarn start. Go, baby, go. Last time, then I give up. Nope, oh well. Yeah, I don't know, because it's a dependency. I mean, we could try changing like TS-lint rules. Like, these are fun to show off, but I'll just do them here and then maybe. But I don't think it's going to matter because they aren't part of my project, right? Can't redeclare block scoped. No. I'll figure it out. There's a tutorial out there online you can follow. But just to show you the different techniques. So the first one is to go to that profiles endpoint. This actually won't work by default, though, because we're running React on port 3000. We're running Spring WebFlux on 8080. So one of the things you can do is in this package.json, you can actually add a proxy. And so if you're doing WebSockets, you have to actually specify WebSockets is true. And then for anything else, you can just pass it to localhost 8080. So this allows you to get around cross-origin resource requests and having the server actually spit back headers that allows you to talk to it. If you're talking directly to 8080, you will need to configure in WebFlux a CORS configuration, so it allows you to talk to it from localhost 3000. But just look at this list and the different techniques. So the first one is an interval. So you can see here how this works is I just have a private interval variable of type any. And what we're going to do is we have this fetch data method that sets the state, goes and talks to that, goes through 3000, and then we just set a timer, right? So every 1 second, it goes and actually grabs that. What happens on the UI is there's a flicker. It's grabbing new records, and you'll see them when I added them, but there's actually a flicker that happens. So that's not a great experience. When you do RxJS, it's a little better. This is very similar, so to make this work, you got to do yarn add RxJS. And then it'll resolve those imports. But you can see it starts with an interval. You can specify however many seconds you want in there. And then it starts with 0. So this allows you to not actually fetch the data first and then wait for events. So you can see all those at the top here are from RxJS, its operators. And it basically goes through and grabs it, and then it subscribes to that observable, and then sets the state when any new data comes in. So this is a much smoother experience. It's still very chatty, right? And you're still grabbing all the records. But on the UI itself, there's no flicker like there is with the raw JavaScript interval one. And so then the other way to do it is with WebSockets. So we'll take this guy out, and you can do WebSockets. So what happens here is you can see it still fetches the initial data, but then it creates a WebSocket for the profiles, and when a new profile comes in, it just grabs that single one and puts it on the list. So this is really the architecture you kind of want, right? Fetch your data initially, but then when new data comes in, dynamically update the list. So this is always listening, and it's open, and that all works pretty well. Event source and server-side streaming is similar, or event source. You'll see that this one opens up a new event source. The cool thing about WebSockets and event source is there's no additional libraries needed, right? Those are just JavaScript APIs that you can use. And this has an on-open that goes and gets the console, and then when the message comes through, implementing on-message, it goes and pushes those and adds to the profile list. So when I first started doing this, I actually lost 2 hours because I was proxying for the server-side events as well, and the proxy in Create React App doesn't support server-side events. So once I tried 8080, it actually worked. But I would encourage you to actually have this on open, because that was getting called, but the message wasn't coming through because it just didn't understand how to do the streaming stuff. So the problem is once you lock all this stuff down, I'm going to show you that because it's kind of cool. I can do it on the React app. I can't do it or on the Spring WebFlux app. You can create basically, first of all, you had to have Spring security dependencies. So this is 2.10 and then M4, I think. Just came out this week, right? Yep, 2.10 M4. And then Spring security. There's all these dependencies. So I just added all those. So this is to do OIDC and OpenID Connect with Spring WebFlux. You need the starter security. You need config, OAuth2 client, and then resource server, and then OAuth2 Jose. And then once you have that set up, you can basically create an application.yaml. And you can specify the OIDC issuer. So I already created an app on Okta that has this information, or created this client ID and client secret for me. And then this is how you specify the issuer. And basically, if you have that not in there, when you start it, it'll redirect you. It'll cause you to go to Okta to actually log in and see everything. So it's protecting you, and the beauty is it's using all Spring security stuff, but since I'm using a snapshot, I actually have to specify the repos down here. So right for the snapshots and for milestones. And that should pull that in. And so now this is secure, but it's only doing one type of security. It's doing redirect security, right? So if we're talking to it from a client, you don't want to hit the endpoint and redirect, right? Because it's a client, right? It's not going to see that when you're doing an AJAX request. So let me just show you this 8080 profiles. All right, it makes me log in now. And now I can see them. The problem is it's not a resource server at this point. It's just a redirect, right? So to do a resource server with OAuth, you basically have to configure some things with Spring MVC first, or Spring Security. First of all, you have to specify a resource server and where the issuer URI is for the JOTs, so it can validate those. And then I also had to create a Spring configuration file. So it's Spring configuration.java. And this isn't being picked up because I haven't added it as a Maven project. And then set up a JDK 1.8. So you can see how this works is basically, I don't know why it's not resolving everything. We'll try that again. Package, com example, demo. Okay, that's better, maybe. But it's basically having CSRF do a cookie-based CSRF token, and that's because on the React side of things, we're going to want to read the cookie, right? And if it's HTTP only, we won't be able to read it from our JavaScript client, so we'll read it as one, and we'll send it back in a header, so that way we have CSRF protection. And then you actually can't secure WebSockets, from what I found. There is Socket.io does have support for sending authorization header. I couldn't get it to work with Spring WebFlux, so that's why that one's open right there. Then I have OAuth 2 login here. That's the one that redirects. And then there's a server here. And basically what that causes it to do is it just looks for an authorization header, right? It grabs the access token out of the authorization header, makes sure it's valid, and then actually hydrates it from calling the user info endpoint for OIDC and creates a user details object for you. This is the CORS configuration that says, hey, if you're on localhost 3000 and you're talking with me on a GET, then I'll let you through. So I can't demo that because React's not working, but that's how it works. So I also want to mention JHipster. JHipster is a project that I work on. I really like it a lot because I was a consultant for 20 years, and I was often doing Spring Boot and Angular consulting. And JHipster basically combines Spring Boot and Angular, and now we have React support in the 5 version, and makes it very easily to generate an application. So when clients would hire me, I'd often tell them, like, you can hire me and pay my nice rate, or you can just use JHipster. And I don't know why, but they still hired me. So I'm happy about that. And then I would just generate the app with JHipster and copy and paste the code. Now, but you could. Like, I still to this day, now I'm a full-time employee at Okta, but still, like, I still generate apps with JHipster and look at the code that it generates because it shows how to do a lot of this stuff. So I mentioned that also because I wrote a book on it, and I'm proud of it. The version 5 is actually coming out in the next couple weeks. It's all done. It's updated. Just hasn't been published yet. It's free. It's on InfoQ. And I had a fun time writing it because I went on the sugar detox as I was writing it. And has anyone done a sugar detox? All right, a few of you. I really didn't know much about it, right? We ordered this book. It's called 21 Days Sugar Detox. It comes in the mail on Sunday, right? And my wife's friend, who's a fitness guru, had talked us into it. She had a big group of people doing it. And so that Monday, we start, and I find out that there's no beer. And I'm like, man, it's going to be a long 3 weeks, right? And so after the first week, my blood pressure medication ran out. And so after college, I went to the doctor. I was probably 22, 23, and my doctor said, you have really high blood pressure. If you don't do something about it, you're probably going to have a heart attack before you're 35. So when I was 38, I finally went to the doctor and said I probably need some high blood pressure medication. He gave it to me. 5 years later, I'm doing the sugar detox. It runs out. So I call the doctor. I'm already in a bad mood, and I'm like, hey, I need a new prescription. He's like, you got to come in, and I have to see you again. I'm like, I'm not coming in. So I waited till the end of the 3 weeks, and my blood pressure was fine for one of the first times in my life. So I wrote an app to go with the JHipster book called 21 Points. So 21 Points is a way for me to track my health, just like Spring Boot can track its health with Actuator and the endpoints and everything. And so how 21 points works is you can get 21 points in a week. You can get 3 points a day. You get a point if you exercise. You get a point if you eat well. For me, that's, no sugar. And you get a point if you don't drink, which is really no fun. So I made it so you can have like a glass of wine, and then you're fine. So it's up there. It's online. You can register and create an account. And you can also create your own InfoQ mini-book. So I wrote it as a mini-book for InfoQ because I just wanted to write like 100 pages, right? I didn't want to write like 200 or 300 pages. I wasn't into it that much. And I did it with ASCII Doctor. And so how InfoQ worked when I started writing the book was it was all Word docs, right? You'd write in Word, you'd edit in Word, they'd create a PDF, they'd create a MOBI, they'd create an EPUB, and all the different formats. And so I said I wanted to do an ASCII doc, and they basically said, well, it's probably going to be our most expensive book, but we like you, we'll do it anyway. They thought I would give them a PDF, and then they would have to do it manually, and they'd have to redo stuff. Well, with ASCII Doctor, we were actually able to generate all the artifacts. And so now I'm in charge of actually generating everything, and within a half hour of me sending it to them, it can be live on the site. It doesn't have to go through all that processing. So it turned out to be the cheapest book that they've ever published. And if you want to write your own, there's a template repository there where you can clone it. Or if you even just want to self-publish a book, you could use that same template and then generate PDF and MOBI and EPUB and all that. So I invite you to try Spring WebFlux, try React, maybe try it tomorrow, because obviously it's broken right now. Try OIDC. I didn't mention PWAs, but I think PWAs are very important, progressive web apps. Progressive web apps basically allow you to have native-like capabilities in your web app. And it doesn't matter, if you're using jQuery or using, Angular or React. It's basically just the ability to have a single-page app that gets cached on a phone. And so it can even work in a browser. But just like you have a mobile app that'll prompt you at the top to install it, progressive web apps offer the same thing. And with service workers, you can actually have a background thread that caches the data. And so you can have an offline capability within your web app. So I'd encourage you to check it out. There's only 3 requirements. One is that it's over HTTPS. The second is that you have service workers enabled, which is just a JavaScript file usually. And then the third one is you have a web app manifest that provides information about your app. So when someone downloads it, they know the name, they know the icons and stuff like that. So enjoy the experience. They are fun tools to work with. But as you can see, when you're on the bleeding edge, bad stuff can happen. So you can obviously do this same tutorial yourself. Josh and I wrote a 3-part series over the last week. So it starts with an intro of reactive programming in Spring, and then he builds the full Spring WebFlux API just like I did. The difference is he's much smarter than me, and he wrote tests. So he has tests for all the Java code and proves like all the WebSockets work via that without having to do anything manually. And then obviously this is a post where we bring it all together with the React client. I also wrote another post in case you're interested in just Spring Boot, Spring MVC on doing CRUD with React, so it shows you kind of some of the patterns there that you might use. Learn all the things. That's all the different series we did. We also published a lot of posts on developer.okta.com/blog. Follow us on Twitter. All of the source for this is on GitHub. And if you have any questions and you didn't ask them today, you can certainly hit me up online on Twitter. All my direct messages are open. The presentation I'll publish on SpeakerDeck after this. Like I said, the code is up on GitHub. Please rate this session. If you have the phone app and you were able to log in, I wasn't, then you can actually rate sessions. And then due to time constraints and someone else coming in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pack up. I'm happy to take questions like outside, and then we can gather there. In the meantime, may the auth be with you.